Good morning to you. Well, as everyone who watched the rugby yesterday knows, there's a big difference between desperately wanting to win and actually winning. Is simply wanting a big election victory going to be nearly enough for Boris Johnson? I've been covering general elections since 1983. None has been as hard to call as this one, with 5 parties in play, a lot of emotion around Brexit and a volatile mood in the country. If anyone comes up to you and says they know what's going to happen, cock an eyebrow, smile politely and turn your back. Nigel Farage, the Brexit Party leader, is today challenging the Prime Minister to tear up his deal or face rival pro-Brexit candidates in every constituency. But Mr Johnson so far says get lost. What's the next move? The Cabinet's rising star, Rishi Sunak, will be listening to Mr Farage, but he's also the man in charge of spending commitments, and he's got some questions to answer this morning about those. Upsetting them both, the shadow chancellor, John McDonnell, promising the most radical Labour agenda ever. But what does that mean for business and taxpayers? A new adaptation of Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials begins this evening on BBC One. I've been talking to its star, Ruth Wilson, about demons, magic, and why these stories are for all ages.
Have you ever seen an armoured bear? Or tartars?
Well, I've negotiated with bears. It's much more tiresome than it sounds. I've fought tartars, and that can actually be quite fun.
Reviewing a busy morning's news, Anushka Asthana from The Guardian and Jane Moore from The Sun. All of that after the news this morning with Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. With just over 5 weeks to go until the general election, both Labour and the Conservatives are making big spending pledges. The government has announced that benefits, including job seekers' allowance and universal credit, will rise from next April. The decision ends a freeze which has been in place since 2016. It is the latest in a series of spending pledges made by Boris Johnson, who's promised more money for the NHS, schools and police officers. Meanwhile, Labour says that it will insulate millions of homes across the UK and fit them with renewable sources of power. The party says that its plan will cut carbon emissions and create hundreds of thousands of jobs. The Liberal Democrats have formally complained after ITV said that its head-to-head election debate would only include Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. The party said its leader, Jo Swinson, should also appear in the debate later this month. They claim that her absence risks misrepresenting the current political reality. ITV says that it intends to offer viewers balanced election coverage. The Vietnamese community in London is holding vigils this weekend in memory of the 39 people found dead in a lorry in Essex. A service last night was attended by more than 100 people. More are expected to pay their respects at a memorial today. Authorities in the UK and Hanoi are still trying to establish the identities of the victims. The authorities in Saudi Arabia have given the go-ahead for the flotation of part of the state-owned oil company Aramco, with the aim of raising billions of dollars for the kingdom. Business sources say that 1 or 2% of the shares in Aramco will go on sale initially. The whole company is thought to be worth more than $1.5 trillion. And finally, an oven is being delivered to the International Space Station so astronauts can bake chocolate chip cookies. A craft containing a specially designed space oven took off from the US state of Virginia on Saturday. Astronauts will test the impact of high heat and zero gravity on the consistency of the biscuits. The taste, I'm sure, will be out of this world. That's it from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Andrew, back to you.
Many thanks for that, Roger. Now, front pages of the newspapers generally, lots of politics, lots of rugby. There's the Sunday Times. Double trouble for Boris, it says, after Corbyn bounced. The Labour Party are moving up in the polls at the moment, it says. It's also got a story about its rival, Trump guru, that's Steve Bannon, the controversial right-wing American, is eyeing buying the Daily Telegraph and the Sunday Telegraph. He apparently thinks they're not right-wing enough. On cue, they're doing their best. Jews will leave if Corbyn wins, it says. A very stunning story, except the quote actually comes from the chairman of the Conservative Party. Now let's move on to The Observer. Tories act to prevent NHS crisis hitting poll hopes. That was essentially the story you were hearing in the news. More spending on the NHS as the election campaign gets going. More spending absolutely everywhere. Boris Johnson has given an interview to the Sunday Express and another exclusive interview remarkably similarly to the Sun on Sunday. But you get the sort of sense of the division at the heart of Brexit Britain from this newspaper, because you've got the Sunday Express front page, Boris, I will get Brexit all wrapped up by Christmas, he's saying, hopes to do it by Christmas. And then you turn the page and what do you see? A double-page advert from Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party saying Boris's deal is not Brexit. We'll be talking about that later in the programme at some length, I'm sure. The Mail has a totally different story about some faked oil paintings, it says, that are in Dumfries House, which has been run and a big centrepiece for Prince Charles over the years. And then I think that's enough of all of those. So let's start. I think we're starting with Jane, are we?
Yes.
Good.
Well, as you say,
right.
the battle lines have been drawn between Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, not least with the Sunday Express splash with Boris, exclusive. Did he know that Farage was taking out a double-page spread ad on the next page? I'm not sure, but
no.
They are funny bedfellows. And also here in the Telegraph, the Tories, Sunday Times, the Tories have offered to make me appear twice. I won't be bought off with baubles. That's Nigel Farage saying that he was offered a peerage. And he's not going to stand down from this. He's not going to play ball. And you know, it's interesting because obviously, you know, a lot of people, whatever you think of his politics, Farage is probably one of the most important politicians of the modern age. The
single figure in the country most associated with Brexit.
Yes.
He's, for a lot of people, Mr. Brexit.
But he's always been the outsider. Even, you know, with Dominic Cummings and the Vote Leave lot, they kind of elbowed him to one side, felt that he didn't play out well with the middle classes. And here we are again. I think he kind of, I don't know, he seems to me like he wants to be an insider. I always thought he had his charm, which was that he was a maverick, an outsider. He wasn't bothered about power per se. Now it looks like he wants to be in the inside, the A-team, and they're still saying, we don't want you. And maybe there's a bit of that wrapped up in this.
And as ever, there are signs of strains inside the Brexit Party.
Yeah, although I just think it's interesting you say he didn't want to be an insider. He has tried quite a few times to be an insider. I think, is it 8 times trying to be an MP? But this is really interesting because Nigel Farage disagrees with this, with his very old friend, Aaron Banks, who has been a donor previously to him. Aaron Banks is just as ardent over Brexit as Nigel Farage, and he's just as critical of Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. But he says that Farage is being very dog in the manger about this and that there's no point in kind of going really hell for leather for seats if you don't think you're going to win. He suggests that could actually split the vote and let the Lib Dems through in some places. And Banks' basic thesis is let this go through, get a majority for Boris Johnson, and then let's have the argument over the trade
hard Brexit
deal. Yeah. Exactly. And I think it's really important because whether ardent Brexiteers who are voting in this election do a Nigel or do an Aaron Banks is going to be quite important to how this election goes.
It's the anything but the Tories vote, isn't it? I mean, a lot of the Labour heartlands would go anything but the Tories, which is where Brexit comes in, the Brexit Party. So, you know, I do think it's going to be a big problem. And
I read this week that Labour think that if the Brexit Party stands in every seat across Great Britain, then that will gift Labour another 40 seats. So it could be the result of the election could hang on what Nigel Farage decides to do this morning, folks.
Well, it's one of a number of things that makes this really unpredictable. As you said, you've been covering elections since 1983.
I'm very old.
Yeah. You never think that one has been as unpredictable as this. And just an example on the front page of the Sunday Times, double trouble for Boris after Corbyn bounce. I mean, their poll shows that Corbyn has gone up by 6 points in a few days. And look how different the polls are. The Tories have a lead of 8, 12, 16 in different polls. And even though those are all Tory leads, what you're talking about, the fact that the Brexit Party will be important in some seats, the kind of Lib Dem surge, which could actually hurt Boris Johnson and affect his majority just as easily as a Labour surge, shows how unpredictable this is going to be. And then there's Scotland, of course, where the predictions range from the Tories losing 2 or 3 seats to the Tories losing all of their seats in Scotland. So that's going to be really interesting as well. The Boris Johnson interview, let's talk a little bit about what he actually says. Yes, well, you mentioned, of course, so the Sun on Sunday have their Boris Johnson exclusive here with the political editor David Wooding.
it reads verbatim, actually, with the Sunday Express.
Why don't you do the Sun and I'll do the Express?
I'm trying to figure out whether or not they're in the same room. I'm assuming they would have been.
Or Boris Johnson has the same lines.
But what I love is Jeremy Corbyn is and we've had a debate about this, so coelacanth, we think, as in celiac.
I always thought coelacanth. This is the elderly fish from the bottom of the Mariana Trench, I now know.
A rare, large, foul-tasting fish more than 100 million years older than the first dinosaurs. And, you know, it's a classic case of Boris's colourful,
rather offensively, he's comparing
education.
the coelacanth to Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, but it's verbatim in the Sun as well.
Yes, so here is the Prime Minister in an exclusive interview in the Sunday Express talking about his deal. He says, you could put it in at gas mark for 20 minutes and Bob's your uncle. Here he is in an exclusive interview with the Sun on Sunday. He says, we've just got to put it in at gas mark 4, give it 20 minutes and Bob's your uncle. And so it goes. It's very, very similar. And he's saying that, you know, vote for Farage, you get Jeremy Corbyn. That's going to be a key message of his. His Jack Russell puppy greatly enjoyed the rugby more than he did. That's about all I've learned.
Yes, well...
Let's turn to a rather more substantial story, Anushka. The NHS. We were talking about it at the start of the show.
Well, I mean, this is really interesting. A December election has a big risk for the Conservatives because in recent years we've had a winter health crisis every year, and the British Medical Association are warning that we are headed to an unprecedented one this year, that people are already piling up on trolleys, that delays are getting longer and longer. And there's a really interesting story here from Dennis Campbell in The Observer, which basically says that Boris Johnson is now having regular direct meetings with the head of NHS England, Simon Stevens, that the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, is meeting him every week, and that they may even set up an NHS operations unit, which would be unprecedented. The issue that is being raised by the BMA is, how come suddenly, when you've got a general election, you're taking this stuff quite seriously and doing things that you never normally would?
There's a surprise.
It does make people feel quite cynical about what's happening. And it kind of doesn't change the issue, which is the Conservatives are going to have to go to the polls at a very, very difficult time for the NHS.
And more generally, it reminds us the Conservatives are spending money very, very vigorously at the moment in a way they haven't before. I mean, Boris Johnson's been campaigning for this election actually for weeks, hasn't he? Charging around the country, molesting bullocks and so forth. And now everywhere he goes, he announces more spending for the NHS, more spending for the police, and it's totting up very fast.
I mean, I love this piece by Giles Brandreth in the Telegraph, talking about when he was fighting a marginal seat, and he hopped into a car. He was on his way to the football club in his local constituency. He hopped into the car with Jeremy Vine, in fact, and a BBC TV crew, and then suddenly realised that he didn't know where the football club was. And there followed this very kind of eggy journey where he was sort of driving around his own constituency, clearly not having been to half of it. And he says, let my own goals be a warning to any aspiring politician. Know thy constituency.
Very good warning. Now, meanwhile, another part of the political landscape, the People's Vote campaign, campaigning for a second referendum, has had an absolutely ferocious split all over the papers today, Anushka.
It's extraordinary. I mean, this split right at the top of the People's Vote. Michael Savage in The Observer has done a lot of really interesting stories on this. I mean, this has been running for a while now, but what I'm really interested in here is this suggestion that the People's Vote was about to come out with a tactical voting suggestion for voters, which is a bit different to the one we've already seen from Best for Britain, another group, which seemed to tell people to vote for the Liberal Democrats in a lot of seats. And this is suggesting that the People's Vote actually had a number of seats, 30 in particular, where they were going to tell people to vote for Labour. I mean, it's not easy to tell how important this rift will be in terms of that campaign. But clearly, one of the things that did happen in 2017, along with lots of non-Brexit things, was that people did vote tactically against what they saw as a hard Brexit. And if Remainers want to stop Boris Johnson getting a majority, they're going to have to do that effectively again.
Yeah, I said we can't predict anything in this election, except for the fact that tactical voting will be a big part of the story on December the 13th as we look at the results, I'm sure. Jane, we're losing a parliament, and in that parliament we're losing a lot of female politicians. Harriet Harman's written a very
interesting piece. She's written a superb piece, actually. She said, you know, this exodus of women is a wake-up call for Parliament, and I agree with her. And she's saying that, you know, on top of all of the shouting and the abuse that women get, they're doing it under the burden of maternal guilt. And I think there gets to a point where you just think, is this all worth it? You know,
Absolutely.
And again, the Observer have done, it's like a general piece about politicians and their security. I mean, we know earlier this week that Michael Gove was having his door reinforced. It's not just women, but women in particular. I mean, Nicky Morgan is stepping down. She basically says that the clear impact on her family and the other sacrifices involved and the abuse for doing the job of a modern MP was part of the reason for her decision.
It's no longer worth it. Very sad. Thanks both very much indeed for that. And so to the weather. Here's a bit of William Wordsworth. Blow winds and crack your cheeks. Rage, blow you cataracts and hurricanos spout till you have drenched our steeples, drowned the cocks. Hold on, you say. That's not Wordsworth. Quite right, it isn't. Over to Stav Daniels in the Weather Centre.
Thank you, Angela. It's King Lear, that is. Very nicely said as well. Weather-wise, much better than what we saw yesterday. Part 2 of the weekend, much quieter. Our area of low pressure, which we had yesterday, is filling and weakening, so less windy and with some sunshine around. We're starting off with some very dense fog patches across northwest England into the North Midlands. This should tend to lift and clear over the next few hours. Stays breezy, quite cloudy and wet across eastern Scotland. Some showery bursts of rain across southern Scotland and into northern England too. But elsewhere, certainly Western Scotland, Northern Ireland, much of England and Wales should see some sunshine. And with lighter winds, it shouldn't feel too bad, 11 to 14 degrees. But it turns breezier again and wetter in the southwest with our next area of low pressure sweeping in tonight. It'll bring windy weather to much of southern England and Wales. Plenty of showers here. Some of them could be quite heavy, and it stays wet and breezy across eastern Scotland. And those lows, 5 to 8 degrees tonight. Low pressure slap bang on top of us then to start the new working week. It'll stay breezy and wet for eastern Scotland, quite breezy across southern parts of the country, particularly through the Channel, southwest England. Lots of showers here as well. Sunshine in between them, but some showers could be quite heavy. It stays wet with the rainfall totals really mounting up across the east of Scotland. Temperatures 10 to 13 Celsius. Andrew.
Many thanks, Stav Daniels there. Donald Trump thinks that Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson are basically on the same side and would make lovely allies. Hardly anyone seems to agree with him, including them. But how the Brexit Party plays the next few weeks, as we've just heard, could well determine who is our next Prime Minister. And Mr Farage is with me now. Welcome, Nigel Farage.
Good morning.
Good morning. First of all, have you decided whether you yourself are going to stand in this election?
I thought very hard about this. How do I serve the cause of Brexit best? Because that's what I'm doing this for. Not for a career. I don't want to be in politics for the rest of my life. Do I fight a seat, try and get myself into Parliament, or do I serve the cause better, traversing the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, supporting 600 candidates? And I've decided the latter course is the right one.
So you're not going to stand yourself?
No, very difficult to do both. Very difficult to be in a constituency every day and at the same time be out across the United Kingdom. Because I do want people to know that when they're told this gets Brexit done, it'll all be over by Christmas, I think is what Boris Johnson is saying this morning. They need to understand that actually what's on offer is a close linkage with all the European institutions, a next negotiating phase of at least 3 years. So I'm going out across the country starting tomorrow.
Now, I just heard you say 600 candidates, so you are definitely you have decided definitely to stand across Great Britain, not Northern Ireland, but Great Britain, around 600 candidates.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've wanted for months for there to be a Leave alliance. It seems obvious to me that no one party can own Brexit voters. There are Tory Brexit voters, there are Brexit Party Brexit voters, and a lot of Labour Brexit voters. And I always thought that to win an election, get a big majority so we can get a proper Brexit, a coming together would be the objective. I still hope and pray it happens, but it doesn't look like it will.
So there's no sign of any reaching out from the Boris Johnson team to you?
Not at this stage, no. I mean, conversations have happened over the previous few weeks, but if Boris is determined to stick to this new EU treaty, then that is not Brexit, and that's the problem. I promise you one thing. If Boris was going for a genuine Brexit, we wouldn't need to fight against him in this election.
Well, I want to come on to what is a genuine Brexit and what isn't in a moment. But before we do, you know that an awful lot of people, including old allies of yours like Aaron Banks, the co-founder of the Brexit Party and so on, really fear that by standing in all of those seats, all of those Conservative seats, you will let Labour in and you will deliver a Jeremy Corbyn government.
I've heard all this before. You know, I mean, I sat here talking to you in 2015 when you asked me the self-same question. Would the UKIP involvement, that was the party I led then, would it mean that Mr Miliband will become Prime Minister. And what happened on the results night? Hang on. What happened on results night? We saw the UKIP 4 million votes hurt the Labour Party more than it hurt the Conservative Party. And it may very well be the same this time round. So that argument
this is on a much bigger
hold.
scale this time. The Brexit Party has been performing much more successfully in the polls than the UKIP Party did back then, and there's clearly lots and lots of Conservative seats which could be handed to Labour. Labour think you could give them an extra 40 seats.
And they thought that back in 2015, and it worked completely the other way around. David Cameron would not have got a majority without the UKIP vote. And again, it's this, we're looking at Brexiteers somehow through this centre-right Conservative prism, completely forgetting the 5 million people who voted Brexit and then voted for Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. And my argument would be, despite what we're hearing about Workington Man and all the rest of it, those people from those communities are more likely to vote Brexit Party than they are to vote Conservative.
And this is the case even for people like Steve Baker and Mark Francois, the ERG, so-called Spartans, who are pretty much as hardline on Brexit as you are. You're going to stand against them?
Here's the funny thing. You can talk about Steve Baker, talk about Aaron Banks. I mean, when Mrs May produced her new EU treaty, Banks and people like that said, we may as well stay members of the European Union. What Boris is giving you is 95% the same, and yet people are saying, I guess out of just sort of Brexit exhaustion, let's just do this. My fear is, if Boris Johnson gets this treaty through, we will never achieve independence. And that's why I'm saying all the Prime Minister has to do is change course, and I would back him 100%.
I want to drill down a bit into why you say it's not Brexit, because Boris Johnson says this gets us out of the customs union, the single market, it gives back control of the borders, and after the transition period we stop paying in money and we're no longer under control of the of the European Court. And all of those things, reading the treaty, reading the political declaration, seem to me to be true.
No, not true at all. You clearly haven't read it.
Well, I have read it.
You know, even when well, with respect, let's just drill down, if you want to, into some of this. Number one, the European Investment Bank. We will have an ongoing liability after Brexit going on for how many decades, I don't know, of perhaps up to nearly £40 billion if things go wrong. Number two, any future free trade agreement, if we signed it, who would be the arbiter of disputes? Can I tell you? The European Court of Justice, who will make binding rulings. It says it in the document.
If we agree to that in the document, in the transition period, that's true. But after the transition period, and business would say...
The transition period only ends if we sign up to a new agreement. Now, Monsieur Barnier, who, by the way, is brilliant, and I wish he'd been working for us, Monsieur Barnier says the next phase of talks will last at least 3 years. How is this getting Brexit done? And I'll tell you something. But when people say to me in the street, well, look, if Boris just gets Brexit done, isn't that OK? When you tell them the next phase will last at least 3 years, they are horrified.
But the transition period, if you're a business and you want some way of getting from where we are now to where the new world that will be outside the EU, the new world transition, you need a smooth path.
The new world will not be actually effectively outside EU rules, because what Barnier brilliantly has written in is that in any future free trade agreement, in everything from financial services to fisheries, we will be tied to the EU rule book, but of course, have no say over how those laws are meant. Now, that is not Brexit. Brexit was, apparently, taking back control of our laws, our money and our borders. And very clearly, this proposition does none of those things.
But if we choose to leave at the end of the transition period with no deal at all, never mind the deal that Boris Johnson's priced, we can. It's clear in the document.
Well, that's fine.
We can go
we hear, yesterday we heard, that Boris Johnson apparently in the Conservative manifesto is going to drop the commitment to leaving with no deal, clean break. Well, if that happens, then we find ourselves in a position where probably the result of Boris's treaty going through is we finish up rejoining. This doesn't get Brexit done. I think this kills off the chance of us getting genuine independence.
The great dilemma for an awful lot of voters is that they hear you and they say, OK, there's a point there, but they also hear Boris Johnson, who ran the Vote Leave campaign back in the day. He was one of the co-people, said it was down to him, who has sacked lots of Conservatives from his party to get his deal through and has fought very, very hard for this deal. And they think, if he says it's Brexit, I'm inclined to trust him.
Well, I suggest you ask him some questions yourself about this. I mean, for example, in the House of Commons, when he was asked what it meant for Northern Irish exporters selling goods into Great Britain, He didn't know that under what he'd signed, they'd need to sign customs declarations. Yeah. When he was asked about fisheries by Owen Paterson in the House of Commons, he said, oh, it's marvellous. We get back control. Well, read Article 72 and see what it says. The point is, I'm not even sure Mr Johnson's on top of the detail of this. The more the British public look at this withdrawal treaty, the less they're going to like it.
The thing is, at some point, you have become a bit of a Brexit purist. If you'd been offered this deal 5 years ago, it's not a perfect deal. Everybody knows it's not a perfect deal. If you'd been offered a deal like this 5 years ago, you'd have been jumping with joy.
I'd have said sling your hook.
Really?
Pointless. It doesn't get us out of anything. It doesn't work at any level. It is a gigantic con. We should not sell out to this. It's a Remainers Brexit. It's virtually worse than staying where we are. And if we go through this route, we will finish up rejoining.
You really think that Boris Johnson is a Remainer?
I'm very happy to compromise in lots of ways. Very happy to do that.
Okay.
But not to...
Okay, well, let's talk about compromise.
I did not spend 25 years campaigning to leave the EU treaty to sign up to another one, and that is what this does.
Well, let's talk about compromise, because what you're asking the Prime Minister to do is to rip up the treaty he has so painfully negotiated over the last few months, get rid of it, and go for what you would call a clean break, other people say a no-deal Brexit, which he knows will split his party down the middle.
To go for a trade relationship. Look, Donald Tusk offered Theresa May a free trade deal. She refused it during those negotiations.
All right.
Going for a close and special partnership, I am suggesting that we go back to discussing simply trade, but not political linkage.
In the politics, we've been quite abstract about this. I want to show you one particular seat, Lincoln, which we've got here. It was a Tory seat. Labour took it last election. They've got nearly 48% of the vote. Tories have got nearly 45% of the vote. UKIP had the difference. It was only 250 votes. Yeah. You stand well. You do half decently in Lincoln, and that will remain a Labour seat.
Do you know, I campaigned in Lincoln a few weeks ago.
Yeah, but you'll turn it Labour. You'll keep it Labour.
I campaigned in Lincoln a few weeks ago in the city centre, talking to a lot of Labour voters in Lincoln who voted for the Brexit Party in the European elections and may well do so again in a general election. Just look in those European elections. Where did the Brexit Party do best? The North East and South Wales, Labour areas. There are millions of Labour voters who feel completely betrayed by a North London-dominated Labour Party that no longer speaks to them.
Short question, is there anything short of tearing up his deal that Boris Johnson could offer you to persuade you not to fight all of those seats?
If he tells me that we're not going to sign a new EU treaty or we're going to pursue a relationship based on trade and friendship, I would say, great.
Finally, there's been a lot of talk about the TV debates in this. And at the moment, the broadcasters tend to be focusing on the Johnson versus Corbyn choice. Who's going to be Prime Minister?
Yeah.
Do you think that's fair?
I don't think it's unreasonable for the two to have a head-to-head, because clearly they lead the two biggest parties. What I do think is this. You know, we finished up last time round with leaders' debates, in 2015, when I was involved, with 7 or 8 people on the panel. And I think there's a very strong argument, actually, for having a debate in Wales, a debate in Scotland, and a debate in England. I really do.
Nigel Farage, thanks very much for talking to us. So listening to that, many Conservatives may be beginning to ask themselves if calling this election has been a terrible mistake. Could they really tear up that deal so painfully negotiated? Well, Rishi Sunak is Chief Secretary to the Treasury, basically in charge of spending all of the money, and a rising star in the Boris Johnson government. Welcome, Rishi Sunak.
Good morning.
You were listening, I'm sure, to Nigel Farage there. You were standing just beside him, so you must have been listening to him. He says he is going to contest 600 seats or so in this general election, which suggests to me that calling the election may be looking like a terrible, terrible mistake.
Well, first of all, it was not an election that we wanted to call. It's something that we were forced to do because of Parliament's inability to make a decision on Brexit. But I'd take a step back. This election provides, I think, a real choice for people watching between real change on the one hand and more of the same on the other. With a majority Conservative government, you're going to have the certainty that Brexit can be done in a matter of weeks with this new deal that the Prime Minister's negotiated. And then we can move on to focusing on the priorities that the people want us to, that impact their day-to-day lives, whether that's getting to see your GP, safe communities, good job that pays well. The alternative is a vote for anybody else, including Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party, just is going to lead to more delay, more confusion, running rings, talking about Brexit for months and months on end, and not getting the focus on what people want. That's the choice.
I suppose my point is all of that is based on if the Conservatives win a big majority, or a good majority, or working majority, and if the Brexit Party stands in 600 seats and mops up a good chunk of the pro-Brexit vote, then you're not going to get anywhere near that. You're going to have another hung parliament, and it'll be another Conservative early election victory, early election campaign, which turns out to be a total disaster.
Well, I think that's why it's important that people watching and people, when they engage in this campaign, realise that the only way to end this uncertainty, to end this indecision and move on to focus on what they want is to vote for a majority Conservative government that, yes, is going to get Brexit done in a matter of weeks, but also has got an exciting and inclusive agenda, focusing on what they care about, whether it's the NHS, whether it's schools, whether it's safer communities and a strong economy. That's what people want to get us back onto. We can only do that with a Conservative government that gets Brexit done and we can move on. No one else can promise that.
Do you think as a party there's anything you can offer Nigel Farage at this stage?
I don't think we're interested in offering anything. What I would say is Nigel has spent his entire career fighting for Brexit. The Prime Minister's now negotiated what I think is a very good Brexit deal.
He says it's not Brexit at all.
Well, I campaigned for leave. I've spent a lot of time talking to my constituents and others across the North East, as he mentioned, and in Yorkshire. What do they want from Brexit? They want to end free movement and replace it with a point system. Just hang on 1 second. This is important. They want to end the fact that money keeps going to the EU year after year. They want to make sure we're in control of our laws. And also they want us to have an independent trade policy. Those are all things that the Prime Minister's deal delivered. So what I'd say to Nigel Farage is sometimes in politics, as in life, you've got to take yes for an answer.
But what do you say to him when he says, for instance, that if we had a trade deal going forward, that will be negotiated and will be under the aegis of the European Court, for instance?
No, that's just simply not the case. Any trade deal with any country, whether the EU or anyone else, would always have in it a set of institutions that do dispute resolution, where you can arbitrate decisions between the two parties. Those are normally formed of joint committees. That's exactly what both the implementation period specifies, and that would be subject to a future negotiation. But crucially, this is the point. This deal allows us to have an independent trade policy, which is something that those of us who believe in Brexit are delighted that it does.
Another thing that he discussed is the question of no deal. Nicky Morgan, your cabinet colleague, said that no deal was going to be off the table and he would not be in the manifesto of the Conservative Party. Is no deal now off the table?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the manifesto in specifically, but what I would say is the Prime Minister spent all this time and energy negotiating a deal, which, by the way, nobody thought he could do, which he's done.
Sounds like it is off the table.
And that's the deal that we will put in place and deliver if we're elected with a majority. But again, we can only do that if we have a majority to deliver it in what I hope is a matter of weeks.
Is no deal off the table?
We've got a deal. Our job and very much our commitment to the British people is we want to deliver that deal. We've been trying hard to deliver that deal in Parliament, and that's why we're having this election, so we can deliver it by the end of January.
Should it be an option going forward under a Conservative government to leave without a deal?
I think, look, the Conservative government has been very clear. We've negotiated this deal. We have a deal that delivers on Brexit, as I said, delivers on what people want Brexit to do. And then once we get on to that, we will talk about our future trading relationship, which will be a strong free trade relationship, which, again, Nigel Farage was talking about. That's what the political declaration says. It's a different political declaration to what Theresa May negotiated. It provides for a free trade agreement to follow the transition, and that's what we'll be focused on delivering.
It sounds like the short answer to my question is that no deal is now off the table. But let's move on to the deal itself, because that is going to be central to this election campaign. How are you going to model, and when are you going to model the economic effects of the deal that Boris Johnson has negotiated?
Well, obviously, you can't model a deal that hasn't yet been negotiated. Of course.
Theresa May did.
Of course. Well, actually, no, what happened there was a set of scenarios for a range of outcomes.
Well, we have a scenario, and we have a range of outcomes. I'm asking, are you going to model the economic effect of the deal that Boris Johnson has negotiated?
Well, there is already an impact assessment for the withdrawal agreement. That's the deal that's been negotiated. But when it comes to the future relationship, which is, I think, what you're talking about, Andrew, it's when you get to that and when you negotiate it, of course, that would be modelled as you would expect, and Parliament would be updated. There are a set of scenarios that are out there already. You're
not going to do any more work or publish any more work about this, because that means we're heading into, effectively, a blind election economically. We have no idea whether this deal is going to make us a lot poorer, a bit poorer, the same, or a little bit better off, or whatever. We just don't know.
No, we have every confidence that the economy is in a very strong place to start with. If you look at whether it's employment, wages, the rate of economic growth, the foundations of the economy are very strong. This deal, by voting it through, would end uncertainty, which would be very positive for business confidence and investment, something that the Governor of the Bank of England said at the time that the deal was negotiated. And of course, when it comes to a future relationship, you can look to the political declaration for our aspirations there.
And
it's
lick
very
your finger
clear
in the
we
air
want-
and stick it in the...
No. Free trade deals like that, which will be deep and comprehensive, which will reduce tariffs, reduce quotas, ensure that goods can move back and forth seamlessly. That is self-evidently good for our economic prospects. And on top of that, the ability to strike new trade deals around the world, to cut prices on goods that we import, all of that will be good for British shoppers and British consumers.
If I may say so, bland, or important, but bland aspirations, the rest of us have to take on trust. We don't know, and we won't know anywhere through this election. What we do know is how much you're spending as a party or proposing to spend. So far, you've spent £5 billion on ending the benefits freeze and raising the state pension. That was announced this morning. £2.7 billion for 6 NHS trusts, 25 billion for new infrastructure spending, 5 billion for broadband, 750 million for new police officers, 7.1 billion schools, and the campaign hasn't even got going. You have already spent, roughly speaking, the extra spending that you attacked the Labour Party for at the last general election as ill-disciplined and irresponsible. You've already done it.
No, I don't think that's true.
It is true.
Well, no, hang on. Coming into this year, if you look at the last set of numbers that we have for the economy for the year that's finished, borrowing was down to its lowest level as percentage of GDP in almost 20 years. And remember where we started from. When we came into office, borrowing £150 billion, £1 in every 4 that we were spending. So to get down to that level last year is, I think, an enormous achievement and means that the economy now is in a very strong footing to invest in people's priorities. And thank you for mentioning police and the NHS and schools. Those are our priorities, as well as investing in infrastructure to provide opportunity
you're
everywhere.
spending money like water, as Labour was proposing to do in the last election. You attacked them for that, and now you're doing the same. The difference is that you're also going to promise tax cuts.
No, hang on. We've just did a spending round, which was those priorities that you listed, and we had £26 billion of headroom under the OBR forecast that were published in March, and that spending round was conducted at 13 and a bit billion pounds, so well within the headroom that was there in the existing set of forecasts from the OBR, showing our sensible fiscal management. And so I dispute the idea that that's happening. And going forward, what you can expect from us...
Don't listen, Rishi, to Andrew Marr. Don't listen to Andrew Marr. Listen to the IFS. Listen to Paul Johnson. He says, in many cases, the Conservative governments of Mrs May and Mr Johnson moved policy decisively in the direction Labour had been planning. You are going to run a left-of-centre economic campaign in this election campaign.
No, I think what you'll see in our manifesto is that it will be fully costed, and with that you will see, as you would expect from a Conservative government, a Conservative party, responsible economic management. So that's what you can expect. I think that is in contrast. So hang on, and you mentioned Paul Johnson. Paul Johnson also said, when we had this conversation last time around in 2017, that taxes under the Labour Party would rise to the highest level in peacetime history, and that they would be paid for by all of us, all ordinary taxpayers. So now that we're mentioning Paul Johnson...
Well, let's mention him yet again, because you mentioned the police. An extra 20,000 police to replace the 20,000 police you got rid of earlier. He says the worst thing to do is to sack 20,000 police and then recruit them again. It's incredibly inefficient and expensive. It is completely incompetent, really, isn't it, to do that?
Well, no, I think you have to remember where we started from. In 2010, as I said, borrowing £150 billion, deficit was 10% of GDP. It was the largest we'd had in generations. It was important that we took action to restore public finances to a sustainable place. That's what the journey we've been on. Now that we're in that place, we can invest in people's priorities. But you talk about police, it's not just about numbers. It's just not just about numbers, though. It's an important. People want to feel safe in their communities. So it's also about stop and search, which the Prime Minister is very, very clear we should use properly. It's about reviewing sentences so that people who have committed crimes serve the time that they should. It's about improving security in prison. So it's an approach to law and order, which I think is what, at least my constituents and what many people around the country want us to see.
Moving on, we're at the beginning of an election campaign. The Intelligence and Security Committee of the House of Commons committed a report on Russian interference during the referendum campaign in 2016 and during the last election campaign. It's sitting in number 10. It's been legaled. When will it be published?
Well, I'm obviously not privy to the National Security Council information, but what is typical for reports like this...
It's a committee of MPs.
Yeah, but what is typical for reports like this is, given the sensitive nature of what they talk about, they tend to go through a process which takes several weeks on average, I'm led to believe, and that's what's happening here, and the committee are fully informed of that process. And
Dominic Grieve, who's chair of the committee, says it should be published now. We need to know if there's any Russian interference going on at the moment as we are taking part in this election. If you delay it beyond the election date, people will be very, very suspicious and angry.
Well, these reports contain sensitive information. It's right that they go through the appropriate security vetting. As I said, that tends to to take several weeks. I think the report was only received a couple of weeks ago, so I know that process is underway and the committee are engaged in that.
You can commit that it will be published before polling day.
I'm not in a position to do that, but what I can say, it's important that it's appropriately vetted, given the sensitive nature that these reports contain.
OK, Rishi Sunak, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Now, with over just 5 weeks to go until the general election, if you're wondering how to register to vote, you can find out all the relevant information at bbc.co.uk/news, or you can check out the BBC News app. Philip Pullman's epic trilogy of fantasy novels, His Dark Materials, has to date sold 40 million copies worldwide. The books have been hailed as instant classics by readers of all ages, and now they've been adapted for the screen in lavish style, losing none of the menace that the original tales inspire. The series has a cracking cast, at whose dark heart is Ruth Wilson as Mrs. Coulter, a woman who isn't everything she first seems. I met up with her recently, and she began by explaining why she loves these stories.
Good evening, Mrs. Coulter.
Good evening, Master.
Lyra, this is Mrs. Coulter. She may be of some interest to you.
Hello.
I am not used to the grandeur of this at all. You'll have to tell me which knife and fork to use. I don't want to make a fool of myself.
It's an amazing book full of theoretical ideas as well as the very human ideas. Philip discusses sin, he discusses redemption, he discusses the idea of authoritarian societies by which ideas and thoughts are suppressed. He discusses the idea of truth. I mean, there's a thing called an alethiometer, which is a sort of compass.
The golden compass is God's one, yes.
Exactly, which tells you the truth.
And for those people who don't know the books, perhaps the most striking thing about this parallel world, quite close to our world, is that every human being has, as it were, a visible animal soul alongside them, the demon. Just tell us a little bit about your demon.
Yeah, my demon is manifested as a golden monkey.
A really nasty piece of work, if I may say so.
He's a very vicious piece of work. He's, unlike the other demons, he doesn't speak and he doesn't have a name. So to me, that was the way I was going to access my character. My character's called Mrs. Coulter, and it's a reflection of self, and it is your soul really manifested as this demon.
And Mrs. Coulter's soul is pretty dark, although the monkey is golden. You're quite sadistic. You are able to be pretty vicious.
She's one of the most extraordinary characters in literature, and I kind of align her to Hedda Gabler. I played Hedda a few years ago, and I just could never quite understand Hedda. And it's a bit similar with Mrs. Coulter.
Was there anybody you based her on? Were there any parallels?
You know what, I thought there's a few things that came to mind when I was working on her. She is both Miss Honey and Miss Trunchbull. She's kind of Snow White and she's the Wicked Witch. You know, she's everything in one. On the outside, she's this glamorous socialite, incredibly intelligent. But inside, I think she's deeply dark, and there's something sort of suppressed and enormous amount of rage, I think, going on inside. And I wanted her outfits to be tactile and shiny and make a statement. They attract children. I mean, she attracts. She's a
child catcher.
She's a child catcher, basically.
Well.
I did actually watch The Child Catcher. I thought maybe he's a bit extreme for Mrs. Coulter.
Have you ever seen an armoured bear? Or tartars?
Well, I've negotiated with bears. It's much more tiresome than it sounds. I've fought tartars, and that can actually be quite fun.
I wanted her to feel soft and touchable, so people wanted to touch her.
But with spikes coming out.
With spikes coming out underneath, yeah. So the way I tried to access her was about this relationship with her monkey. And there's something psychological about it, and there's also something physical about it. So I've decided to bring a bit of monkey into Mrs. Coulter. You'll see it come out as the series goes on.
Now, as I mentioned, this is quite a dark, tough story in many ways. And there is this kind of parallel universe run by something called the magisterium, which is a bit like the Catholic Church as an authoritarian global power. Now, the real Catholic Church, and I know you were brought up a Catholic, is very upset about this. What would you say to them?
I said I mean, from my book, I'm a Catholic, so I don't worry about it too much. I think it's, for me, the books are a discussion about the idea of any kind of authoritarian society, or a society that dictates how you should think and feel. And I think Philip is discussing the idea of freedom of thought and of ideas, and even if they contradict each other. It's the idea that we can have that expression of thought.
Let me ask you about a few other things that you've done. Mrs. Wilson, about your grandmother. Now, that was an absolutely extraordinary story. People will now understand that her husband was bigamist, a multiple bigamist. What did it do to your family afterwards? I mean, you put your whole family very much on the screen, out there for the public. It must have had some repercussions afterwards.
Yeah, I'm a pretty private person, so it's quite a mad thing to do. But no, it's been an amazingly healing experience, to be honest. We only met each other all about 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, and that's all my dad's new siblings. And they age range
from... So these are children of different families, all from your father?
My grandfather had 4 wives, and he had kids with all of them. And the oldest is now 98. And my dad is in his 70s, and the youngest is 60, so they frequently meet. And when I screened it for the whole family before it went public, and it was the most extraordinary experience. It was a 4-minute silence, and everyone was crying and hugging each other.
I'm sorry, what right do you have coming here? He lived with us. He loved us. Why won't you just leave me alone?
We need his body, Mrs. Wilson, for the funeral.
No, but I've arranged a mass in a local church in Ealing. It's what we wanted.
No, my mother has arranged a burial service in Southsea.
No, but I'm his wife.
And so is my mother.
No, she's not. She's deluding herself.
It just felt like, I think, a lot of secrets or holes existed in people's narratives that they could now fill, or slowly they'd found each other and discovered what those questions were in their past. They're able to understand who their dad was, and then where they all belonged in that world and how they existed. And also, there was no money to fight over. There was no... We now have a little Wilson estate that any proceeds or anything from profit from Mrs. Wilson, which was probably 10p, that goes to the whole family and divided equally. And they have various events. We just published my grandmother's memoir, which it's based upon, called Before and After. And we had a little gathering to celebrate that. So I just think it's been a really positive experience, luckily, for all of us.
Ruth Wilson, it's been a blast. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ruth Wilson there, and his Dark Material starts this evening on BBC One at 8 o'clock. It'll be available on HBO internationally from the 4th of November. So, in effect, the election campaign has begun, and Labour have come out of the traps with one big, repeated claim that an American trade deal with Donald Trump under the Tories would betray the NHS. In Jeremy Corbyn's words, the NHS is up for grabs in a one-sided Trump trade deal sell-off. John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, is here. And the reason I've started with that, John McDonnell, is that it's not true.
Well, from what we've seen of the evidence from the dispatches programme of civil servants negotiating with pharmaceutical companies, I think it is true.
Well, let me read you. I mean, we had Nigel Farage on the show a little bit earlier on, and he in turn had Donald Trump on his radio show. And then Donald Trump said about this, not at all. We wouldn't even be involved in that. No, it's not for us to have anything to do with your healthcare system. No, we're just talking about trade.
And you believe Donald Trump? Because I think you'll be one of the few people in this country that actually does.
Well, we have to
Donald Trump has been seen to be, on this particular issue, made a number of contradictory statements. We have to go on the evidence. The evidence of civil servants, on 9 or 11 occasions sitting down, negotiating to sell our NHS.
Well, let's not believe Donald Trump. Let's look at the evidence that we've got elsewhere. Trade deals, by and large, cannot determine the way health services around the world are run. The Americans did a trade deal with Australia. They don't have our NHS, but they have a publicly funded health service, and that was not touched by the trade deal. And in terms of Canada and Singapore negotiating with the EU, again, there are special clauses which ensure that a health service free at the point of need can be aside from these trade deals.
Why are these meetings taking place then? Because the deals that are being negotiated then means our NHS will be hit with high pharmaceutical costs and will be ripped off. It's the first wedge, it's the first foot in the door of selling off our NHS. I do not believe Trump's assurances, and I don't think many people do. There is a risk here, and I believe nobody would want our NHS put in the hands of Donald Trump. It's not even safe in the hands of Boris Johnson.
But a trade deal is something different, is what I'm saying. The implication, what Labour is saying, is that if the Tories get in next time round, then in a few years' time, the next time I'm going to my NHS hospital, I'll be asked for money. And that's not going to happen.
No, I believe what we're talking about is privatisation on the NHS on a scale we've not seen so far. Although this government is privatising the NHS, billions are being put out to private companies. We believe that what's happening now is the first step in selling us out to American pharmaceutical companies and other private companies. And I do not believe Donald Trump, because he's made contradictory statements. The evidence is before our eyes. The meetings are taking place already.
About 7% of our health service at the moment is run by private companies right at the moment, something that New Labour was part of and has carried on for years and years and years. And American companies are also involved, and they're allowed to be involved because of EU regulations giving them the access. So again, I ask, what really is going to be different?
Our argument is that when those contracts run out, we will want to insource this provision, because we believe then it's better under democratic control and actually better provided and better integrated into the NHS. And at the same time, you are not then shelling out for shareholders' profits. In that way, we get a better service and actually more cost effective.
Would a future Labour government, if you were elected in this general election, would you get rid of all privatisation inside the NHS?
Yes, our argument is that as our arguments that these contracts run out, they should be brought in-house, because we believe in a democratic NHS, and we believe actually we shouldn't be allowing people to profiteer from the NHS.
So at the end of the Labour government, no commercial involvement in the NHS at all, period?
We'll see how those contracts run out, and we'll protect the patients and we'll get a better service. But I think the general public feel as though we shouldn't be pouring money into the pockets of profiteers.
You said that this election campaign, this election manifesto will be the most radical one ever. Last time round, you said to people who weren't thinking about income tax and wondering how much they were going to pay, that if you earned less than £80,000, basically Labour would lay off you. Is that going to be the case this time?
I'm trying to maintain that only the top 5% will pay a bit more, and we'll be honest about that. And as you know, in the last general election, we provided a fully costed manifesto. It's interesting the Conservatives are now going to say the same thing, but we'll see how fully costed theirs is. But what I'll do is, in terms of income tax, we've said very clearly the top 5% will pay a bit more, 95% of the population of the earners will be protected.
And in terms of people trying to think of the numbers, the top 5% is 125,000, roughly speaking, and they pay a 45%.
Those ones above 80,000 will pay 45p, that's what we said, and 50p above. The figure then was 123,000. That's what we're aiming for in this election. But you'll see, as we do the full costings of our manifesto, exactly where we stand about all these issues.
You're trying to stay, roughly speaking, where you were in 2017.
Roughly, yeah.
And is the same the case for corporation tax?
No, yes, I've said as before, we will restore some of the tax cuts that have been given away to the corporations, and we'll use that for investment in skills and training, exactly as actually a number of those corporations are calling for.
Doesn't sound like it's going to be a lot more radical than the 2017 manifesto.
Well, you'll see when we publish the manifesto, and I publish it. We always publish now. This is the first. I'm the only person in Shadow Chancellor who's actually done this. The first person to do it. Alongside the manifesto, we'll publish what we call the Grey Book, which will be a fully costing of that. Yeah.
OK, and now for an awful lot of people watching, there is one issue which is bigger than Brexit, bigger even than inequality or taxation, and it's climate change.
Yes.
And this is the single biggest thing facing the Labour Party. Now, you said a little while ago that you would like Britain to be a carbon-neutral country by 2030, but you didn't think it was practical. Since then, the Labour conference has passed a motion calling for us to be carbon-neutral by 2030. Can you deliver that?
It's the objective that we've set ourselves, and I'm really working hard at the moment. Well, we're working right the way across all our teams with scientists and others and technicians to see how fast we can go. I think we might be able to, but it's going to be tough, and what we've got to do is look at every area of policy to enable that to happen. The issue for us now is actually when we go into government, I know Brexit's important and we'll deal with that, but actually our number one priority must be the survival of our planet, and that will be key to all our policy making, and that includes within the Treasury itself. We're rewriting the rules upon which investment will be made. Number one priority is climate change, the second is inequality, individual and regional, and the third is the fourth industrial revolution. On all of those, they will set the agenda for us in government.
And you've made a big announcement today about warmer homes with huge numbers claimed of extra jobs. They seem wildly out of kilter. Hundreds of thousands of extra jobs from insulation?
Well, look, we've got 27 million homes we've got to insulate. Introduce solar power to them, introduce heat pumps as well. That's a huge task, massive programme. You're talking about 200,000 jobs to do that. That's actually calculated, us working with companies and with trade unions and others, means a huge training effort. In the supply chain, there's a calculation, there's another 200,000 jobs that would be available.
So that's, if I may
and
say...
These are good, these are skilled jobs and well-paid jobs as well, and secure.
That's a popular, warm announcement. Let me turn to a slightly tougher area, which is aviation. According to the Committee on Climate Change, the projected rate of increase in aviation around the country is more than twice what it needs to be if we're going to meet our targets, not by 2030, but by 2050.
Yeah.
It follows from that a future Labour government, on day one, must cancel the Heathrow expansion.
You know my personal view on Heathrow.
I do, but I'm asking about the Labour government.
Well, let me just say, we set ourselves criteria, one of which environmental impact, the other was also the economic impact and social impact. On the current criteria, we've said very clearly, Heathrow expansion doesn't qualify.
So you will cancel the expansion of Heathrow?
At the moment, it does not qualify on the basis of the criteria we set out.
Now, it's not just Heathrow, of course, because all around the country there's the same thing. Manchester currently has 28 million passengers going through it, and they want to move to 55 million passengers every year. Leeds Bradford wants to move from 4 million passengers to 7 million. East Midlands from 4 million to 10 million. All around the country, there are very, very ambitious airport expansion programmes going on. I'm saying if you are serious about climate change and really changing the direction of travel, you have to stop them all.
Well, there'll be the same criteria will be applied to all the expansions, whether it's aviation or any other expansion of our transport system, and we'll make judgments on that basis. In some areas, expansion does actually help on climate change because people are then not travelling, for example, to one central hub like Heathrow. So all of them will be determined on that basis, on the basis of environmental impact, economic impact and social impact.
I guess this is quite an important issue about who has the most influence inside the Labour Party and on John McDonnell. Is it the climate extinction protesters out on the streets, or is it the unions? Because Len McCluskey and 5 other union bosses are very in favour of Heathrow expansion because they say it means 180,000 jobs. Have you got the spine to say to Len McCluskey and the big figures in the union movement, terribly sorry, you can't have it, there are more important things?
Look, I think that's a wrong depiction. These unions are campaigning alongside us to tackle climate change.
But they're in favour of Heathrow expansion.
There'll be difference of view on individual issues, but they adopted the same criteria as us. And don't underestimate that the very trade union members who are working within the Labour Party and campaigning alongside us have as equal concern as us on climate change, and they'll want to balance the issues around climate, economic impact and social impact.
But they say Heathrow expansion will grant them another 180,000 good unionised jobs and therefore must go ahead. I'm going to be absolutely clear that a Labour government would say to them, no, it's not going to go ahead because of climate.
What we've said so far, exactly, I repeat, it does not meet the criteria we set. Simple as that. But, you know, those jobs are also can be expanded within the climate change programme we've put forward. 400,000 new jobs, both on this Warm Homes programme and the supply chain. And they'll be good jobs and they'll be unionised jobs as well.
A year ago, we talked about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Rabbi Sachs had just made his thing, and you shook your head and you said it's terrible and something must be done and we're on top of it. Can I just show you the front pages of the 3 biggest Jewish newspapers in this country this week? Vote Corbyn, vote to stop Corbyn, urges Rabbi. The nightmare before Hanukkah, and Prime Minister Corbyn, he'd harm the Jewish way of life. And that is Rabbi Jonathan Romain. Now, you know, I know that the party slogan is for the many, not the few, but there is one community in this country who feels you are not represented by the Labour Party.
I know. I'm so saddened by this. I just want to reassure them we're doing everything we can. Everything I said we'd do, we're doing in terms of the Labour Party, eradicating anti-Semitism from the party. We're also doing everything we can to educate our own members. We're doing educational courses. All the things that they've asked us to do, we're doing. And that will enable us then to reassure the Jewish community that actually the Labour Party will ensure our society creates a safe and also a decent environment for them and for everybody else.
But you said zero tolerance, and so far there's been 146 warnings to people about anti-Semitism. It doesn't sound like zero tolerance.
Well, the issue of that is we looked at the gradations of the impact of what people have done, kicked people out. Other aspects is about many of our Jewish members have said these people actually need re-educating. That's why we've set up an education course. And in that way, we're actually we're doing everything asked of us. I'm saddened by the statements that have been made, but I just give this commitment to the Jewish community. We're doing everything we possibly can, and we will work with them.
Does this feel like a winning campaign this time?
It does, actually. I think the polls are coming our way. I think they're beginning to move in our direction. We know how far we are behind in the polls, not as far behind in 2017. I just think we're addressing the right issues. We're sorting Brexit out to bring the country back together again, tackling the main threat to our very existence in climate change, but also we're ending austerity and tackling inequality in our society on a scale that we've not seen before. And I think that's inspiring people.
John McDonnell, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. That's all from me. Thanks to all my guests this morning. We've got an extended programme next Sunday. See you then.